So I hope I'm close enough. Thank you very much. I'm extremely grateful for TEPAV for inviting me now for a second time. Now, I think it was 2 years ago that we had a session. I know that it was a less optimistic time from the point of view of constitution making than now, and I'm even more excited to be able to be here when a consensual process of constitution making has been put in place. I would very much enjoy discussing that process with you, and I'm greatly honored for members of the Commission itself to be here, that they are here and that they're interested in discussing this matter. After all, though I have been here in Turkey about 4 or 5 times now, I am not a Turkey expert, and I focus only on constitution-making issues when I talk about Turkish problems. You have many other problems too. Constitution is not the only issue here, but I certainly have followed only the constitution-making process with a good deal of care. Well, we'll turn to Turkey in a few minutes or toward the end of my presentation, which I will try to make maybe about a half an hour or maximum 35 minutes. But I've been charged, and I'm very happy to talk about processes in other countries. It may seem like an arbitrary set of countries that I have chosen for this presentation, but there is a reason behind each choice. Obviously, Turkey, we're here, and I'm anxious to discuss Turkish problems with you. I introduced the South African process to indicate that the thing can be done well, and it can succeed in a country which is as divided, perhaps much more so, than Turkey is. I mean, think about the problems, let's say in the year 1990 in South Africa that had to be resolved, and which the constitution-making process has resolved, at least in part, in significant part, I would think. Many problems, of course, remain. I introduced my own home country, Hungary, Magyaristan. It's nice that you call it in a way that resembles our own word for ourselves, because, you know, Hungary is Magyarország to a Hungarian, and it's only through a Latin error that we have become Hungary. I think it's always interesting to talk about Turkish-Hungarian history here. As the ambassador, who's an expert, you can find out a great deal about that from him. But I want to introduce Hungary only in a special way here, and that special way has to do with the failure of a process, specifically the 1994-1996 process, because one can learn from failure too. And I introduce Egypt to indicate that things can go wrong, quite seriously wrong, when one is making a constitution, and that has really serious consequences. So that's the choice of the countries. Now, there's a theoretical framework in the back of my mind. And that theoretical framework, I think, in politics is not so new as it is in theory. But in theory, it is, I think, a new framework, because we have been so much, especially Europeans and Turks too, have been so much under the influence of the French Revolution and its model of constitution making, that the idea that there are really fundamentally 2 democratic forms may be a strange one to you, but I think there are really 2 fundamental democratic forms. One democratic form is when one body, one entity, one institution presumes on the basis of either having played an important role in the liberation of a country, or because of elections, democratic elections, to speak in the name of the people as a whole. One body, one institution, sometimes one person like Napoleon Bonaparte, who was famous for having said, "Je suis le pouvoir constituant." And in a way, he was representative too, one could argue, because he was very popular in 1798. Perhaps he never said this, but he could have. In any case, that model I call the sovereign model of constitution making. And I think the politicians among you will know that in practice there is something else possible. In theory, we have not developed this other thing, which I would want to call post-sovereign, which is not a very good term because it just describes something in relationship to something else. We could call it a constitution-making process based on democratic legitimacy. Sovereign constitution-making against constitution-making through democratic legitimacy. And in that case, I think what is important is that no body, no institution, no person makes the presumption to speak in the name of the people as a whole, but one understands rather that democratic will, democratic interests, democratic values can be only expressed by the action together of many bodies, many institutions, many political tendencies. We could call it, as a shorthand here, consensual constitution making, because that is the term that you will recognize. Undoubtedly, this has existed historically. If I were giving a historical lecture, I would compare France and America in the 18th century. The very famous political scientist, political philosopher Hannah Arendt, German-American, has written about that comparison, and so have many other people. But the American model has not been influential in the world the way the French has. And in a way, consensual constitution making had to be rediscovered. And I think the contribution, not just of South Africa now, but also the Central European countries, and before them Spain, was to put a model like that on the agenda. I think more in practice than in theory. And I think my small job has been, as I understood it since 1990, to analyze that possibility theoretically, and also what form it might take in different contexts, because a theory is abstract, but reality is always dependent on the context. But in any case, we have had such practice, and we know at least some of the normative desiderata, some of the normative values which that practice has embodied. And consensus among actors is only one aspect. An important other aspect has been, in lots of places, South Africa has developed this to a very high extent, a multi-stage process. In other words, you make a constitution not in one step, but in several. The French Revolutionary model was a constituent assembly makes the constitution, and that's it. In this respect, the American practice was different. But in the 1970s, it has become customary to do the process in several steps, thereby applying legal rules to the process itself, establishing legal rules in the first step, which then structures the second, third stage of the process, depending on the country. Another aspect has been important is the role of constitutional courts. Very surprising from a French point of view, quite extraordinary that a pouvoir constitué, a constituted power, plays a role in the pouvoir constituant. And yet this has been a practice in lots of places, even Egypt recently, although it led to tremendous conflicts. Well, it led to conflicts in Turkey too. This is a second important aspect. Another important aspect of this process is popular participation. You have seen an interesting depiction of that in Turkey, in lots of venues and lots of places. One of my criticisms, and I'll make a few of the Hungarian practice in 1994-6, that this was neglected. But certainly in South Africa, elsewhere, Poland too, popular participation, public visibility, inputs from various groups, also including civil society, have been part of this practice. This was not common at the time of the French Revolution, and as a matter of fact, in countries influenced by the French model, always assumed that the parliament speaks for the people as a whole, so why it expresses the general will, as even some French constitutions used to say. So why talk to the people when the general will is already here? Why duplicate the will, was the French way of putting this. But today we duplicate it and triplicate it. The will is expressed by all kinds of venues, all kinds of contexts, and participation is a very significant part of that. Now, what I think makes the problem greater today is that the German writer Carl Schmitt had a phrase for this. I don't follow him in lots of things, but this I think he's right about, is that there is a horse race, Wettkampf he called it, Wettrennen in German, between two powers in the state, which in the way he used it was between the Constitutional Court and the supreme power that held sovereignty in the state. But I think this can be adapted to the context which I'm discussing, the constitution-making process, to which he would not have applied it. He thought of that in a purely French revolutionary sense. In other words, in all the countries, one can see and feel a conflict between the sovereign model and the consensual model. There's a horse race between them, a Wettkampf or Wettrennen between the sovereign process of constitution making and the consensual one. I think this was neutralized in South Africa most of all for unusual historical circumstances, because in that place neither the existing dominant party at that time, the National Party, the white party that monopolized rule in South Africa and was dictatorial even with respect to the white community, was not able to carry out a constitutional reform on its own from above. But at the same time, the revolutionary movement led by the ANC was incapable of carrying out a revolutionary transformation from below either. In a way, the two candidates for sovereign constitution making, which saw themselves in those terms, the reformist one and the revolutionary one canceled each other. Neither could accomplish the task on its own. This they must have seen as unfortunate, each one of them, but after the fact, probably they both recognized it was extremely fortunate, because this allowed them to come together, which they never would have done had one of them been able to impose. So the South African model becomes, the South African paradigm becomes a model of what can be done, but its circumstances are not always given. In some places, let us say Turkey, the process from above is possible. It was especially possible in the past parliamentary session when the governing party did have the 3/5 required to take a constitutional draft to referendum. But even today, it's relatively close to that. I mean, 5 votes, you think, well, 5 votes, 6 votes, one can get that somehow, right? I mean, in the United States, Lyndon Johnson used to buy them. But there are ways of making special deals with somebody. You know, 5, 6 votes is not so many. So that option exists in the world. And if you take the revolutionary option, yes, Egypt, Tunisia had revolutions where new forces were put in a position to establish constitutions on their own. So what I call reform and revolution, and you all know, of course, these classical terms, is still possible, and in that sense, each one of them is capable of being the context for sovereign constitution making, one of the two options. But I think, interestingly enough, even in the countries where reform and revolution is possible, and you can see this in your own country, you can see this in Egypt too. The international norms which have evolved since the 70s, first in Spain, then in Central Europe, then in South Africa, are strong. So the international norms exist. You know, no one spoke about consensus at the time of the classical constituent assemblies. They were elected by the people, and they chose their own rules, and that rule usually was majority rule. As useful as consensus would have been, let us say for Lenin in 1918, when the Constituent Assembly existed in Russia, since he didn't have that majority, he just dissolved the assembly, because he could only see the matter in majoritarian terms. Consensual terms didn't even enter into his mind. But today these norms are around. For example, Turkey, which I have already mentioned, is a country of a possible majoritarian road, a possible role where the holders of sovereign power could make a constitution, since the 1990s had consensual models around. You know, roughly the same time as in Central Europe and South Africa, in the same international milieu, in the same context. You created, perhaps the names are a little different in each epoch, conciliation commissions, committees, but basically multi-party forums for coming to an agreement about the Constitution. Now, of course, those days you had the issue that no party was in a position to do it alone. So there was constraint. But nevertheless, the norms were established and they're around. You see it in most writings on the subject. On some issues I have disagreed with Professor Özbudun, but certainly he and Professor Gençkaya together mentioned consensus in their book on Turkish constitution as having become an important value. So this idea is around. And certainly legal continuity, legality is strong here as well. Constitutional Court has played a role. So in this sense, the norms are around of the alternative process. And I think one can show also in Egypt, where first the Supreme Military Command, the SCAF, and then secondly the Islamic Brotherhood were positioned to impose constitutional declarations, constitutional rules, roadmaps, and in the end a constitution. There too, consensual approach is around culturally and politically. It's spoken about all the time, sometimes from the streets, sometimes on the part of alternative political organizations. It is not repudiated even by the Muslim Brotherhood. So even in a context where you have a real revolutionary scenario, the norms are around. People speak about round tables, having a national dialogue. Why do you have to have a national dialogue? You have the votes. Why can't you just impose? Well, because there's a normative constraint that even they have to face. Tunisia, which has a revolutionary process too, because of a very good electoral rule that they chose in the beginning, consensus is constrained, because they are no single force, and now is not in position to make the constitution alone. So the norms are around, and in this sense, I think we have to realize that we are in a post-revolutionary epoch. The French Revolution, as François Furet has already argued back in the 80s, is perhaps over now. And we have learned to do things differently, which has advantages. I mean, think about the French Revolution, as glorious a process as it was. Its solutions always created the context for civil war and dictatorship. And so, yes, they made constitutions, but they wound up making so many of them that none of them had validity. And you want to make constitutions in such a way that they last, or at least they represent a framework for a significant amount of time. So I would say that the horse race is still on today. You cannot neglect it, and especially if a consensual process, once established, fails, which is always a possibility. There's always a possibility in some countries, at least, to return to the sovereign process, the majoritarian process. I would say also in some respects a populist process. Let me illustrate this with the case of my country, I have two countries, two passports, but Hungary is my original country, and I feel, I think, deeper identity with Hungary than even the United States. Let me illustrate this in the case of Hungary, that a process, a horse race, can go in the wrong direction. In 1994-96, when I actually was an occasional advisor for Hungary's Liberal Party, the Alliance of Free Democrats, I was drawn into the process even earlier because I think perhaps mistakenly I was an advocate of a coalition with the Socialist Party at the time. That perhaps turned out to be a mistake, and you'll see in just a second why I think it was perhaps a mistake. But in any case, it was clear that there would be a constitution-making process. Now, in that time, the two coalition parties had 70% of the seats, which through our disproportionate electoral rule, they have gotten through something like 50% of the vote. You'll recognize this in Turkey as a problem because even now it is a 49+ % of the vote that gets pretty close to 3/5 for the governing party. Earlier on, interestingly enough, after the 2002 elections, there was a much lower vote that got almost 2/3 for the governing party, and then in between, a somewhat higher percentage of the vote got the governing party as somewhat less, but still 3/5. Interestingly, the tendency is that the vote is becoming bigger and the parliamentary number of seats is becoming smaller. I'm not an exact student of the Turkish electoral process. I don't quite understand why this should be so, but it has been the trend. But one thing is constant here too is that it has never been even a majority of the vote that led to a very large number of constitution-making seats or near constitution-making seats as now. Well, Hungary, it was over 50% of the vote then that led to over 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. In Hungary, the amendment rule is simple. 2/3 of parliament amends. It's a single-chamber parliament, and the president of the republic plays no role in the constitution amending process. Nevertheless, this was very dramatic for me, and I think I was influential to some extent in helping the process to move in this direction. The leading parties agreed to inaugurate a consensual process. Now, Fidesz, the now governing party of Hungary, you all know, your prime minister just visited Hungary. Fidesz, the now governing party, was then a minority party, and it was extremely nervous about what they called the possibility of constitutional dictatorship. I don't know if all my Hungarian friends now recall that Fidesz was at that point the strongest advocate of a consensual process. They wanted to make sure that it would be done in a way that they too would be consulted. And the leading parties, under the influence of lots of people, I would say János Kis, my friend, was the most important, but I played a role too in the press, and several others agreed to set up a consensual process, and this was done. It was agreed that it would be 4/5 of Parliament that would make rules for a constitutional making process, and this was even put into the Constitution itself, in a way trumping the 2/3 rule. It was agreed that a committee would be set. Then it was agreed under the 4/5 rule, which was used for this, that it would be a new committee based on parity of 5 parties at the time that would make the Constitution. It was also agreed that 4 out of 5 parties have to agree to every proposal to replace a feature of the old Constitution. And 2/3 of the members there, you see, it's a little different in your setup, 2/3 of the members there would have to agree as well. So it was what the Europeans call double majority system applied. But pretty high level of consensus, though not absolute consensus. And I'm glad to report that this committee was able to complete its job. It was able to actually to actually make a constitutional draft. I wrote an amendment rules for them, and this they didn't adopt. They actually didn't decide what kind of amendment rule they would have. I was upset about it, but you see, constitution-making process is one in which every participant becomes upset to some extent, because the whole idea is that you create compromise among different groups if it's a consensual process, and so no one gets everything they want. Interestingly, the Socialist Party, the then dominant party, that alone didn't have constitution-making majority, but certainly was able to stop any constitution from being passed, didn't get two important things they wished for: a second chamber established on corporate lines, and they didn't get a legalization of social rights, which would become only directives of state policy or goals of state policy in the Indian and the Irish way, but not made into judiciable rights. They were very upset about this, but they signed anyway in the committee. And then what happened was, for me, a tragedy. Once it came to Parliament, where the Socialist Party still was able to stop anything, they sort of figured out, the leadership figured out, that if the ministers would vote against the draft, which they didn't make, the process would be stopped. And this is what they did. Gyula Horn, the then Prime Minister, Justice Minister Vastag, and a few other of their ministers, and enough members voted with the hard right. I called it at the time a black-red coalition. Probably brown-pink might have been better, or black-pink would have been a better way of describing it, because the Socialist Party was no longer the old Communist Party. In any case, they brought down the process. And the process then died. I thought the Alliance of Free Democrats should have left the coalition then, and that's why I think that it was perhaps a mistake to be too wedded to that other party. But anyhow, they didn't do this. I think in the process, undermining their own long-term existence. That's not even today an important party in Hungary. But the story doesn't end there, because then in 2000, well, the elections were 2010, right? The current parliamentary elections. The current governing party was elected, and it was elected with over 50% of the votes, but through the Hungarian system received over 2/3 of the seats, together with its partner on the same slate, the Christian Democratic Party. And they also put into place a constitution-making process. I don't want to characterize too much the constitution. I don't think that it's as bad as some people say and not as good as some other people say. I would say the same for Egypt, actually. The outcome in Egypt is not as good as the Brotherhood would say, but certainly not as bad as the opposition would say. It's often like that. So there's even implicit compromise in majoritarian processes. But the point is that the Hungarian process of 2010 and 11 was a strictly majoritarian process, in which the opposition parties were no longer asked to participate at all, or if they were asked, the conditions of participation were such that they refused. In any case, a consensual process did not emerge. And this remains, I think, a very severe block on the legitimacy of the constitutional outcome. The Constitution exists. There's a constitutional court still functioning under it. I think it is still a real constitutional court. But I think the opposition in Hungary, most oppositions, whether grassroots or political parties, do not see this constitution as theirs. And they all say that the first chance they get, they will redo it. Well, that will depend on electoral outcomes. And of course, popular mobilization. But it's not an ideal outcome. When you make a constitution, a brand new one, and it's so contentious that half the country doesn't accept it. The same thing in Egypt, where, by the way, as against a reformist project in Hungary, it was a revolutionary process. They also produced a constitution, but it is not accepted by a good part of the street, not accepted by a good part of social movements, not accepted by what is in effect secular opinion, and not accepted by lots of parties, including even moderate Islamic party of Al-Futu. So in this respect, the models are parallel. South Africa, which is the case I started out with as the positive one, brought together historical enemies who are certainly more antagonistic to one another historically than any two groups here. I would even say that the Kurdish-Turkish antagonism is not of the same level as black-white antagonism was in a system of apartheid. I mean, Kurds here, maybe Kurdish participants will disagree, but they have civil rights. They participate. They elect parties. Their personal rights are not in jeopardy, but of course they have other issues, and they think they would be always in a permanent minority, and so they want further provisions. But certainly this is not comparable to the condition of the black majority in South Africa. Yet they came together in South Africa. So the result was a constitution which both sides could accept. And indeed, a real marginalization of the extremes occurred. The white right and the black revolutionaries became marginal in the South African context. And so a general acceptance of the constitution emerged. This, I don't think, is the case in Hungary. It's not the case in the Egyptian case. And let me now just a few brief remarks on Turkey, because this is your country, you know it better. Why should I lecture to you about it? But let's just so you see the way I look at the process, and then we can discuss it in any kind of detail that you wish. Now, in the Turkish case, yes, there has been a consensual model around, and this consensual model, even in the year 2002, had important achievements. You imagine that the CHP, AKP, AK Party opposition is fundamental, like some of the other oppositions I mentioned before. But the fact is that they even cooperated on the coming back into parliament of the current prime minister. So agreements between them has been possible historically. It's opposition on lots of issues, I grant. I don't want to de-emphasize them, but these are oppositions that could be historically dealt with. I think 2007 is the year when the antagonism became sharp. Certainly it was felt on one side that the other side was sabotaging a legitimate presidential election. And on the other side it was felt that now the governing party was willing to break with the consensual pattern of the past and impose its model in a majoritarian way. So in the horse race, it was felt by one side that the populist majoritarian model was winning. And the subsequent conflicts, whether over the issue of the headscarf or with the conflicts of the Constitutional Court, were all colored by, at least from my perspective, by that initial very harsh conflict. Because even in the existing system, the presidency was a very important stake in the state. To get the presidency in a majoritarian way was considered to be a huge problem from the point of view of at least the oppositional parties. So I think from this point of view, you have to see that the way those conflicts were resolved in 2010, 2011 through the amendment package and the transformation of the Constitutional Court was still seen and is still seen by the minority as part of the majoritarian. Remember, I'm still speaking about two roads: the majoritarian road, the road based on sovereign constitution making. And in that context, I think there was a lot of fear in society that now the next step, if the elections work out one way or another, if they work out to produce an even bigger majority for the governing party, the next step will be majoritarian constitution making, sovereign constitution making, through a purely reformist process. This fear was there. But the electoral trend I mentioned, amazingly enough, dealt with that trend. You could say the Turkish people dealt with the trend, but of course you can't say the Turkish people in their single mind figured out to give the AKP 5 votes less than they needed to resume the previous trend. This just happens through the mechanisms. The people are never one in that sense, and they can't think as a collective actor during the elections. But in effect, it was through the legitimacy gained through the election that the governing party was deprived of that majority. I don't say that many members of it would not have wished for a consensual process anyway, But I think it's hard to do when the numbers are there, because in that case, in the case of any opposition, somebody can say within the party, let's do it our way, we can. And we go back to the people for approval in a referendum. But they cannot do this now. So through that logic, and I think partially through the history, the earlier history of consensual constitution making, the committee of which very distinguished members are present was constituted. And I think this is a huge achievement that this could be done, and this was done. I mean, after all, the governing party could say, well, then we don't want to do it at all. We'll wait for another election. Or they could have said, we won't worry about it. We'll just get 5 deputies, 6 deputies, some such way. And you can always get, as I said, 5 or 6 somehow. I don't want to talk about what the meaning of that somehow is, because I want to see what your own views are. But anyhow, they didn't do that. And so I think there was goodwill on the part of both the governing party and indeed the minority parties, because they entered into a deal which ultimately still depends on the majority party voting for it. So I think there was goodwill on all the sides, and the committee of which you are a part was constituted in a way that brings credit to Turkish society and Turkish politics and the experts who participate in the process, to everybody who had a role in it. But it remains a precarious, let me end with this, it remains a precarious process, and there's a heavy weight on the members, because I think they do have a role in whether it will be successful or not. They do have a say, they do have a role to play, which is an independent role, even if the party leaderships continue to be important. And so I think it's a heavy responsibility, and I think the success, not just of a party, but the Turkish state, in some sense, depends on what they do. It's really, the weight of the country is, in a way, on your shoulders. And if things go wrong, then in some ways you also carry some responsibility. Of course, which party the most, you'll disagree about that. One will always disagree about who will be blamed if the thing fails. But I think we know that if there is success, then each party will contribute. So failure will have many explanations which will compete. But success can only have one explanation ultimately, that everybody contributed, everybody played a role, everybody was constructive. Because if even one party wasn't, it can't succeed. So everybody has to play a role in order to make it work. And the problem is, and this is the thing I noticed in the press, is that unlike in Hungary, where there was a moratorium on normal constitutional amendments, there isn't one here. And so the other process remains a reserve process, a majoritarian one. And so the horse race is still on. You are still fighting between two alternatives. And of course, the members here are committed to one alternative. Their personal success, their prestige, their professional dignity will depend on the success of one alternative. But there are other people in Turkey, possibly spoilers, and possibly people who have their own agendas, who, have perhaps a different attitude. And so there's a fight, there's a conflict, and so all of you depend on whether all of you are able to contribute to one outcome, and it also depends on you whether that outcome will succeed against the alternative. And I just mentioned then 2 things that I have learned. We tried to discuss that in a small group just previously, but 2 things I have learned which help to contribute to possible success. One of those things has to do with the independence of the commission. Can this commission establish, aside from loyalties to their parties, which of course they always will have, a kind of loyalty to the group itself? And to say we are engaging in a deliberative process in which we are trying, like Jürgen Habermas's idea, right, of dialogue and arriving at mutual understanding. We are engaged in a process, we are aiming at mutual understanding. And that means that we do have a collectivity within which this has to be done. And as much as we want to channel party political opinion into the committee, we also need to influence that opinion through our corporate processes. We don't want to be in a situation where party politicians who have to always go out, publicly represent their views, whatever they are the only important actors. They are less able to make a compromise than you are, and I think it's important to eventually influence them rather than the other way around. And the other thing that I have learned is that the experts play a huge role. For whatever reason, and probably professional interest plays a role, the language of law plays another important role in this, and the fact that the experts, after all, don't have to run in elections and don't have to get votes, all make them more amenable to compromise. South Africa, this was especially important, is that a lot of things are first hammered out on a purely expert level, where even the members of the commission are not there, just their legal experts. The legal experts do have allegiance to the party, so they're not entirely there as pure experts. And I don't think it's good to have foreign experts, as some countries have used foreign expertise, Kenya and so on. I don't think foreigners should play a role. I discuss my views with you, but I would not like to be part of it in any direct sense. It's not healthy. It creates all kinds of problems, also on the level of public relations. The experts should play a role, and of course the experts should really look at all the results of these great deliberations in society, because eventually you have to go back to society. Even in the case of a referendum, you have to go back to society. You have to actually make sure that in some ways social aspirations are met. But I think the independence of the experts is also important, partial independence of the experts. So I would say that's another important thing that I have learned that is useful. But the most important thing is the integrity of the committee and the commission. Eventually you have to go back to the parliament. Eventually you have to get approval. You have to pay attention, unlike in Hungary, to the interest of the most important party. You don't want to have an agreement on this level and then vote it down in parliament. And this means that you have to recognize the political power relations. AKP is a stronger party than any opposition party. So in some sense, the outcome has to be skewed toward there. I know, there a group of some people don't like it, but you shouldn't use the veto power to get rid of politics altogether. So in this sense, I would say in Hungary it would have been good, at least on the two major issues of the Socialist Party, to concede that issue. And I think social rights would have been the better one, rather than a corporate chamber. But in any case, it is most important to keep the Commission alive, to allow it to develop its own independent view, and to try to influence the political process from here, rather than to let the political process totally control what happens in the consensual process. Thank you very much. I think that would be quite enough.